Good afternoon. My name is Nick O'Doherty. I'm part of Beehive, an organisation we set up 2 or 3 years ago with Cormac Heron, who's also here this afternoon. Cormac's a bit of an evangelist about the use of social media within organisations. I'm more of a reluctant convert. You can tell I'm probably older than most of the people around here. And I came to it the hard way. Initially, as I say, reluctant, but seeing the value in it. My background is more to do with IT and with sales, IT management and things like that. My role in the organisation we both worked for beforehand, PwC, was as one of the IT directors. And whilst I was quite used to getting in the neck for failed projects, and quite often they were our fault, I took exception when the projects failed and they weren't our fault, but we still got it in the neck. So I started to learn defensively about change management as it applied to IT projects. And to some extent put that into play when we were getting more responsible for social media within PwC. Beehive, as I say, is the organisation that we set up. So what I really want to talk about is how to make change happen when it comes to social media related projects. In some ways they're almost harder than IT projects. And if you're changing your accounting system from Sage to SAP, there's a certain amount of compulsion to use SAP at the end of it, however appropriate it might be. But you can't necessarily apply the same compulsion to using a wiki or a blog where such a thing was not used before. So, to my mind, change is not rocket science. That doesn't mean it's easy. Arguably, the dandelion is a simpler concept than the rocket. At one level it is, a rocket, you put together things in a prescribed way, add some hydrogen and oxygen like the blue touch paper and retire. A dandelion is much more complicated if you've got to get into the DNA and the chemistry of it. On the other hand, if you want to grow dandelions, it's bloody simple. Just lay down some grass seed and it'll grow anyway. So I see change in the same sort of way, actually. A lot of it's pretty obvious, but most of it isn't thought about. Usually, in large organisations, it's not thought about because it costs money. And whilst people expect to spend $1 million here or a few $100,000 there on IT or things like that, the concept of spending money on softer issues doesn't normally occur. So people don't tend to do much about it. I have an equation. Here's Cormac, by the way. Cormac was kind enough to ascribe this equation to me in several blogs. This is not true. This is not my equation. It was created by some other people a little while back. But they say that change happens if D times V times F is greater than R. Now, I don't think it's a great equation, but it's quite useful for actually thinking about things. D is about dissatisfaction with the current state. V is a vision of how things could be. F is clarity about the first steps you need to take. And R is about resistance. And I've split resistance into two kinds, organisational and personal, because both come into play within organisations when you're looking to make changes, and particularly so when you're looking at social media related tools. I want to focus on resistance first because I think it's more interesting in some ways. Many of you will be familiar with the 1-9-90 rule, the kind of concept that if you're using a wiki, that for every one person who initiates something, there are 9 who will kind of add to it, amend it, tidy it up, structure it, etc. And 90 who will actually read the article or the content. Arguably, the rule is slightly more complicated than that. It's more 1, 9, 90 and 900. For the 90 who actually read it, there are 900 who don't even know it's there. Now that's, I think, got some truth in it. It's a bit like the equation. It's got enough truth in it to make you think, but I'm not sure how far it actually goes, because I think when it comes to wikis and things like that, you might find for any particular article that there's 1 initiator and then 9 people who add to it. But I'd like to think that within an organisation, different people initiate different articles and add to them or modify them in some way. On the other hand, that 1-9-90 rule does actually highlight the fact that for people who are not used to them, who come across them for the first time, thinking about how am I going to, or what am I going to contribute, is a real issue. In talking to people about things like blogs or wikis and asking about why they're not contributing, these are the kind of answers I've had people come back to me with. Are you familiar with these, or are you such hardened contributors that it's been a long time since this has applied to you? Have you come across any other kind of reasons people come up with? For me, the one that I find most interesting is the who am I writing for? But I'll come on to that. So how do you overcome their reluctance? Well, the issue about I don't know how to is very simple. Training can normally deal with that, or coaching. I found it's quite useful when talking to people about things like how they might use some of the social media tools, to advise them to start by listening. I find it interesting when people sort of, list the kind of social media tools that you ought to know about. Things like RSS feeders are seldom mentioned, but they're a tremendous way of actually organising your capability of finding out what's going on out there. Blank page syndrome. We were talking about this with Guy Fraser a little bit earlier on. He says for developers, blank page syndrome doesn't exist. Developers love blank pages. It's a great opportunity to put something on it. But for most other people, starting with a blank page is quite frightening. And some of the best advice we've had in terms of how to get wikis successful is to pre-populate them to some extent. To put in a complete thing in one place, to start something somewhere else, to put in a few questions in another place. There is a view as well, it's quite useful to introduce mistakes if there aren't any, because some people's contribution is to correct the mistakes. And it's quite a good way of getting people involved and starting to think they're making a contribution. And maybe from doing a bit of gardening and correcting the mistakes, you feel perhaps empowered to start something going yourself. One of the interesting pieces of advice I've had when blogging is view your post as the start of something rather than the finish of something. If you make your post completely finished, then there's no opportunity for other people to make a comment or add to it. I said that one of the things that I found most fascinating in terms of the questions people raise as to how to contribute and why they should contribute is, who should you write for? And my friend Cormac, who's playing with his iPhone at the moment, suggested to me that I should write for myself. It's something that he does. He's a banjo player. And apparently, I don't understand this, but the chording for banjos is different to the chording for guitars.
Tuning. Tuning.
Oh, the tuning. I totally didn't understand it. Anyway, when he finds out how to do something, he blogs about it, because, as he points out, he can then find the information via Google. Whereas if you put it into his own filing system, he'd never find it. So, writing for yourself is quite a good idea. If you're interested in the topic, then the likelihood is other people will be. And I mention all of these things in the context that I think I might have sort of gone too fast over. The idea of personal resistance to change when it comes to social media. If you're being encouraged to use wikis and blogs within your organisation, these are the kind of issues that are likely to come up with a number of individuals. If you ignore them, you can expect the fact that your wiki will not have a huge amount of contribution. If you try and address them, you'll start to find out how difficult change can be in some circumstances. Laying on training is quite easy to some extent, but some of the other things do require more one-on-one, or some kind of leadership, or some kind of involvement in a more structured way. But in addition to the more personal resistance, there can be organisational resistance, that parts of the organisation feel that they are not willing to get involved with the changes that are being suggested. This hasn't come out quite as it should be. Benefits versus costs, and priorities versus resources. And sometimes this can be a cause for confusion from the people championing the change. They've made a very strong case that there's good reason to do this, that there's strong benefits to be gained, the benefits outweigh the costs, that it's a priority for the organisation to do something about this problem, and this wiki, this blog, this whatever is going to be part of the solution. And yet they find parts of the organisation just don't buy it, or that they understand intellectually the argument that something needs to be done, but they're not willing to do something, and therefore they stymie the whole activity. And this can be a cause for confusion. As I say, if you're championing something, you see the value in it, and you've made the case for it. But the issue is really about priorities, and the issue is about how much can an individual or an organisation cope with. It's really about how many balls can you keep in the air. And for different managers and groups in the organisation, it might be 2, 3 or 4. But when you come along with a 5th one, it's one too many. They're not going to take it on because they're afraid of dropping all of the others. So although you've got a good reason for something, you can get organisational resistance because there's too much else going on. There are ways around this. Some of the old-fashioned ways in terms of large top-down projects involve things like stakeholder management. And I think I'm not going to cover too much about this at the moment. I'll skip through this. We can perhaps talk about it later if you're interested. But it's basically looking at the key people. It's looking at what their position is, what their position needs to be, and how you're going to move them. There's been a lot of good work done on this in terms of formalising it. And this is a slide we pinched from Cranfield University. And basically it just looks at the idea of, for a group, what benefit do they perceive, what change is needed, what resistance is perceived, what commitment is there, where are they now, where do they need to be. Then the interesting thing is how you're going to get them there. To my mind, the main approach to overcoming organisational resistance is to some extent to sidestep it. Don't try and make changes across the whole organisation when half of it are not up for it. The great thing about a lot of these social media tools is that you can introduce them virally. You can introduce them into parts of the organisation where they're not overloaded, where they see the value of it, where there's strong local sponsorship. If they're successful there, it's going to help them to become successful elsewhere, and I'll explain why in just a minute. But normally with these things, if you actually provide a service to one part of an organisation and withhold it from others, the other parts, suddenly come banging on your door and saying, why have HR got this and we haven't, kind of thing. So there's an element of very fundamental psychology as well as, sort of project management. So far I've been looking at the right-hand side of this equation, D times F times V has got to be greater than R. Let's actually look at the dissatisfaction side. And this we'll go through a little bit more quickly. As I say, I find it less interesting than the resistance. So the concept is, people are more likely to change if they're unhappy or dissatisfied with the status quo. And that's relatively obvious. If you've got boring work or high pressure work, and the change means that the work's going to be less boring or less high pressure, you don't have to deal with unhappy customers all of the time. Some of them might even be happy and it could be quite enjoyable working with them. It's more likely that you're going to support the change. Part of the problem is, though, that not everybody is going to be dissatisfied with the status quo. Not everybody is going to think that the change is going to be an improvement for them. This is another reason for actually looking at things like viral change, looking at making changes in parts of the organisation where there's more enthusiasm, and leaving aside those where it's not so easy to make that case. Another aspect of this equation is that you need to have a clear vision of how things might be. You need to have the same vision for everybody, because if you start giving different visions to different parts of the organisation, people talk, they'll find it, you'll lose credibility and the project will lose credibility. But it may be expressed differently for different parts of the organisation. For some you can focus on the beautiful sunset, for others on the idyllic island, and for others the beach in the foreground. But you've got to be looking at the same picture for all of them. In all cases, the language you're going to use depends upon the part of the organisation you're dealing with. And HR people and IT people, for instance, talk quite different languages. The final element on the left-hand side of the equation is this clarity of the first steps. They may be dissatisfied with where they are, they may have an idea of where they're going to go to, but it's quite important that the first few steps are are very clear in terms of what people have to do. This maximizes the confidence with which you approach it, minimizes the confusion. It's another reason for actually looking at a viral approach and actually dealing with the more enthusiastic parts of the organization first, because any kind of lack of clarity about the first steps is likely to be masked by their enthusiasm. You have the opportunity of practicing those first steps, getting them right, and then trying them out elsewhere. Quite often, in situations like this, it can be useful to get some outside help, people who have some experience of undertaking this kind of change activity the first time, and then you can roll it out with your own resources subsequently. I want to give you a quick example of what I mean and to try and put it all together. We were dealing with a London university. The previous IT director bought a wagon load of social media software from IBM, connections, things like that. He wanted to use it. It was an embarrassment. They hadn't found anything to use it for. And we started to look at what things that they could use it on. And one of the approaches we took was to look at problems that were being experienced by different departments in the university and whether social media could help. I mean, the great thing about a university is it is split into so many fiefdoms and sort of departments. And what you tend to find as a problem in one is usually a problem to a greater or lesser extent in many of the others. One of the big issues they were facing was that students were complaining that communication with them was poor. A few years ago they probably have ignored that, but since students are actually paying for going to university now and are more like real customers, it becomes a more real problem. One of the things that the students were focusing on was they turn up at lectures to find that it had been changed and it was in a different room or something like that. There was the notice on the door, a 10 o'clock lecture on saline drips has been moved. This university did a wide range of courses, but they also trained nurses. And the nurses were different in the sense that whilst most of the other students actually lived kind of residentially somewhere in the centre, the nurses tended to live at home and were scattered all around London. The campus was big, and moving the lecture from here to there could be a couple of miles. And if you're coming in from 7 or 8 miles out and then had to move 2 miles subsequently, if you'd known about it in advance, you'd have used a different line. You'd have come in on the central line rather than the Piccadilly or whatever kind of thing. So for them, it was a really big issue. And we were looking at the idea of using social media to inform students of changes of lectures in sort of good time. The nursing community, the head of the department was really wishing to deal with this problem. So we had a situation where the local sponsorship was clear. They could explain the vision to the nurses. There was real dissatisfaction with the status quo. We were able to give them some very clear first steps. In this case, it wasn't strictly social media. We were looking at texting them on mobile phones. Most of the nurses didn't have smartphones or things like that, so it had to be something perhaps more direct. And there was no resistance on the part of the nurses in the sense that, as far as they're concerned, they didn't have to do anything. They get a bleep to tell them the lecture had changed, hopefully an hour or so beforehand, and they could change their travel plans accordingly. And this is an example of what I'm saying about using it virally. Getting it working with the nursing department meant the other departments were starting to ask for it because it had turned out to be so successful in that area. So, as I said, I don't believe this formula is necessarily complete or completely accurate. I think it's a useful framework to think about change within an organisation. And despite what Cormac says, it wasn't my formula anyway. I think in the notes it will tell you who came up with it. Those are where we got our images from. Thank you for your time.